The Shadowpeak Mountains stood tall and imposing, their peaks shrouded in a perpetual veil of mist. These mountains had long been the subject of local legends, tales of spirits and ancient curses whispered among the villagers. Despite the ominous stories, the majesty of the peaks drew many adventurers, including Jake, Emily, Tom, and Sarah, who had meticulously planned their expedition for months. The thrill of scaling uncharted terrain overshadowed any fears the legends might have inspired. Ignoring the villagers' warnings, the group set off early one autumn morning. The hike began uneventfully, the crisp mountain air invigorating, and the dense forest at the base of the mountains alive with the sounds of nature. They laughed and chatted, their spirits high despite the gray clouds that loomed overhead. By midday, they had reached the tree line and began their ascent. The path became steeper, the terrain more rugged. The air grew colder and an eerie silence settled over the mountains. The only sounds were their footsteps and the occasional clink of gear. Emily was the first to notice the whispering. At first, it was barely audible, a faint murmur carried by the wind. She tried to dismiss it as her imagination, but the whispering grew louder, more distinct. It seemed to come from all directions, echoing off the rocks and swirling around them. The group pressed on, but the atmosphere had undeniably changed. The mountains felt alive as if they were watching and waiting. As dusk approached, they set up camp on a small plateau. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the wind howled through the peaks. They huddled around a small fire, the flickering flames casting long shadows on the rocky walls. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, a chorus of voices murmuring in a language they couldn't understand. The firelight flickered, casting eerie shapes that seemed to move and twist in the darkness. A loud crack echoed through the night, and a gust of wind extinguished their fire. The whispering grew louder, more urgent. Panic set in, and they decided to head back down. They doused the fire, not wanting to attract any unwanted attention, and ventured into the darkness. The path seemed unfamiliar, twisted and distorted. The whispering never ceased, and shadows seemed to move just beyond the reach of their flashlights. The air grew colder, and a sense of dread settled over them. Hours passed, but they made little progress. The mountains seemed to twist and turn, leading them in circles. Exhaustion and fear took their toll, and tempers began to fray. The whispering had become a constant presence, a malevolent force that seemed to push them deeper into the mountains. Just when they thought things couldn't get worse, they stumbled upon a cave entrance, a gaping maw in the mountainside. The whispering was louder here, a chorus of voices that seemed to beckon them inside. They fashioned a makeshift splint for Emily, who had twisted her ankle and took turns supporting her as they continued their descent. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. They turned to leave, but the path was gone. The mountains had shifted again, trapping them. Panic set in, and they ran, heedless of the dangers. The whispering voices followed them, a constant reminder of their plight. In their frantic flight, they stumbled into a narrow ravine, the walls closing in around them. The air was thick with mist, and the whispering was deafening. They could see figures moving in the fog, shadowy shapes that seemed to reach out for them. Exhausted and terrified, they huddled together, the whispering now a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from the very mountains themselves. The figures in the fog grew clearer, taking on human-like forms. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and their mouths moved in silent incantations. The friends could feel their minds slipping, the whispering invading their thoughts, filling them with dread and despair. The night stretched on, and the whispering never ceased. The figures in the fog drew closer, their glowing eyes and silent mouths a constant torment. The friends felt their sanity slipping away, the mountain's malevolent presence seeping into their very souls. They could no longer distinguish reality from nightmare, their minds a blur of fear and confusion. As dawn approached, the whispering finally began to fade. The figures in the fog dissipated, leaving the friends alone in the ravine. The mountains seemed to release their grip, allowing them to find their way back to the path. They stumbled down the mountain, their bodies and minds exhausted. They reached the base of the mountains, the villagers' warnings echoing in their minds. They never spoke of what happened in the Shadowpeak Mountains, the memory too terrifying to recount. The whispering remained with them, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked within the mountains. The legends of the Shadowpeak Mountains grew, the tales of spirits and curses spreading far and wide. The mountains stood tall and imposing, a testament to the terror that lay within their mist-shrouded peaks. But this was only the beginning of their ordeal. As the group tried to resume their normal lives, the whispering followed them. It invaded their dreams, their waking moments, a constant presence that could not be ignored. Each of them dealt with it in different ways. Jake became obsessed with finding an explanation, poring over ancient texts and local folklore. Emily grew increasingly paranoid, convinced that something was always watching her. Tom tried to drown it out with alcohol, while Sarah retreated into herself, barely speaking to anyone. One night, Jake had a breakthrough. He discovered an old manuscript that spoke of the Shadowpeak Mountains and the entity that dwelled within them. The text was cryptic, filled with warnings and descriptions of a malevolent force that fed on fear and despair. The entity was ancient, older than the mountains themselves, and it could only be appeased by a ritual sacrifice. Jake knew what he had to do. He called the others, explaining what he had found. They were hesitant, but the constant whispering had driven them to the brink of madness. Desperate for relief, they agreed to meet at the base of the mountains. Under the cover of darkness, they made their way back to the Shadowpeak Mountains. The whispering grew louder as they approached, a cacophony of voices urging them on. They followed the path they had taken before, the memories of their previous ordeal fresh in their minds. They reached the cave entrance, the gaping maw in the mountainside. The whispering was deafening now, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from within the cave. They entered, the darkness swallowing them whole. Their flashlights barely pierced the inky blackness, casting long shadows on the cave walls. Deeper and deeper they went, the air growing colder and the whispering more intense. They finally reached a large chamber, the walls covered in ancient symbols and drawings. In the center of the chamber was a stone altar stained with the blood of countless sacrifices. Jake stepped forward, the manuscript clutched in his hand. He began to recite the incantation, his voice trembling. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, as if the entity itself was responding. The ground shook and the air grew thick with a malevolent presence. As Jake finished the incantation, a figure materialized before them. It was tall and shadowy, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The whispering voices converged into a single deafening roar. The figure extended a hand, its fingers long and skeletal. Jake stepped forward, offering himself as the sacrifice. The figure grasped his hand, and Jake felt a coldness spread through his body. The others watched in horror as Jake's life force was drained away, his body crumpling to the ground. The whispering ceased, and the figure dissipated, leaving only darkness and silence. The others stood in stunned silence, the weight of what they had just witnessed pressing down on them. They gathered Jake's lifeless body and made their way out of the cave, the air feeling lighter, the malevolent presence gone. They returned to the village burying Jake in a small cemetery. The whispering had stopped, but the memory of the Shadowpeak Mountains and the sacrifice they had made would haunt them forever. The legends of the mountains grew and the warnings became more dire. No one ventured into the mountains willingly anymore, but the stories continued, passed down from generation to generation. The Shadowpeak Mountains stood tall and imposing, a testament to the terror that lay within their mist-shrouded peaks. The entity remained, waiting for the next unsuspecting souls who dared to venture into its domain. The mountains were alive, and they were hungry, ever watchful, ever whispering.